Why has this self-hating become a Western obsession?
I think it's oversimplified, but I think Enlightenment philosophy has played some role.
Yeah. Is that part of the reason that you noted earlier that the Enlightenment skipped?
Yes.
Okay, develop that a little bit then.
So why I say Enlightenment philosophy played a role, I mean, there are many examples. We mentioned Jean-Jacques Rousseau, Voltaire, for example. If you read his works, he places a lot of emphasis on, as many modern philosophers do, sort of detachment from the community. We have to cultivate your garden, which is a good thing, but the Voltairean view of cultivating your garden is, don't look at what's happening in the world out there, just focus on your garden at your home, something like that. But Voltaire also writes a lot about how other, you could say, civilizations are actually better than the West. He writes a lot about the East, about...
So that's interesting, That could be actually an indication of something that I think was part of the reason for the destruction of Rome. And Nietzsche wrote about this a fair bit.
Mm-hmm.
So imagine you have a relatively homogenous local community. Let's call it Christendom.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, well, there's a lot of fractionation inside Christendom and a lot of factions fighting. But roughly speaking, there's an overarching ethos, which is Christian in its essence. And even the warring parties agree on many things.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, but now you expand and you encounter, the Chinese, let's say, and you encounter the Indians, the actual Indians, these sophisticated alternative societies, the Buddhists, the Muslims, who have cultural traditions as sophisticated and rich as your own. Well, so Nietzsche's take on that was twofold. He said, well, first of all, you think you're right to begin with, but part of the reason you think you're right is because you don't know any other ideas. It's like 14th century Christians didn't believe Christian things. They weren't like Enlightenment rationalists who adopted Christian superstition. I mean, they looked at the universe through a Christian lens. There wasn't another viewpoint apart from a couple of secular people and some heretics. It was like the world was Christian.
That's your frame of reference.
That's everything about it. You see, there's no contrary philosophy. Okay, now you expand. Well, and you're also doing this with regards to the Enlightenment discoveries and scientific. And now there's like 8 competing viewpoints, each of which has the same depth, let's say. And so at some point you have a terrible case of indigestion. And then Nietzsche says something even more subtle than that. He says, well, first of all, there's a monolithic worldview. And so you're pretty secure about that because that's just the way things are. Then you encounter these competing belief systems and they're pretty compelling, and competing ethical systems as well. Mm-hmm. And then it starts to become a question when it never was, who's right? Well, good luck sorting that out. That's what wars are for, right? It's really hard to sort that out. But then Nietzsche says something even more interesting. He said, well, you have belief system 1, and then you encounter belief system 2, and you see there's a conflict, and it isn't obvious who's right. Then you add belief system 3 in there, and you think, it's not just that there's a conflict in belief systems. It's that the idea that there's an absolute truth itself, or even truth itself, now becomes questionable. That's when moral relativism makes its ugly appearance, and nihilism. And so not only do you lose faith in your initial unquestioned presuppositions, but you lose faith in the idea of certainty itself. And then you have no strength. I mean, I think part of the reason the Romans couldn't withstand the barbarians, let's say, is because they died of indigestion. Like there was no unity of purpose anymore because they had bitten off more than they can chew. And you could certainly, I think, part of the reason the UK is in the dreadful situation that it's in now is exactly because of that. It's like when you go to India and you're a little island and there's hardly any of you, and you go invade India, it's a real toss-up who's invaded who. Like you might have the upper hand for 50 years, but when you're outnumbered by a factor of, 100 at least, who's going to win that contact is by no means obvious.
Yes. So maybe a different way of putting this, as opposed to talking about Enlightenment philosophy, is to say the West has had to make this, the West went through some form of a recognition that the Western frame of reference is not the frame of reference, but a frame of reference. And I think a lot of people in the West we're not quite sure how to deal with that.
We still aren't.
Yeah, which leads to a lot of conflict. And one way of
doubt.
Yeah, and one way of dealing with that is to say that our way is right and everyone else's way is wrong, and we need to enforce our view on the rest of the world.
Yeah.
And
then you get a kind of ethno-fascism that can develop out of that.
Yes, and that doesn't work. It
well, that's got its problems, let's say.
And another way of dealing it that is equally bad is to say, well, we need to dissolve. We have an identity crisis as a result of this. And so maybe those guys are better than we are. And I think the appropriate solution lies in the middle. The golden mean is to say that we have a particular frame of reference, and we see that in South Africa all the time, that there's a Western frame of reference, but people who aren't Westerners don't have that frame of reference. And one practical example in South Africa is property rights. So we believe in individual ownership of property.
Because we also believe in individuals.
Yes, yeah. But the Zulu culture is much more one that emphasizes a monarchy and communal ownership of land. So the king owns the land. And I don't think the correct way to deal with that is for me to go to the Zulu people and say, you guys are wrong. You need to change your culture. You need to adopt our way of thinking. And it's not that easy to navigate. And I think that's why South Africa is such an important case study for the world, because we have these communities living on this piece of land. And how do we deal with that? Because people think about things like history, as we mentioned, differently. They think about things like property rights differently. They think about ownership and so forth in different ways. And the appropriate way to deal with that is not to try to enforce your way of thinking onto the other, but to try to find a way where there's mutual recognition and respect between different perspectives.
But even that presumes that there's something like boundaries, right? Like, so that you can each have your space, so to speak. And so there's a metaphysic under that even, which is, well, there can be treaties, and the treaties are made between sovereign, individuals, or at least sovereign peoples. Like, and even that can be, as pointed out, say in the massacre, there was a treaty there. Well,
which to us was very important, but in their culture, it's not that big a deal. And a signed document is almost irrelevant.
Well, the fact that there's eternal war between different tribes is an indication of the complexities of negotiating such things.
Yes.
Right. But it is the case as well that there's two streams in human history, and one stream is kill the foreigner, and the other stream is no, we've got our differences, but they have something to offer and we have something to offer. And if we can get the trade arrangements right, we could both be better off. Right. And, well, that's the battle. It's like, can you get the trade arrangements right? That's really hard. And if you don't, well, then it's capitulation or mayhem. Right. So we're trying to figure out how to get the trade arrangements right. And you guys are right on the cutting edge of that.
Yeah.
Okay. Now, this book of yours, Kill the Boer, let's flip to the modern times. Now, I can remember in the 1980s going to McGill, and at that time, apartheid was a major issue. And we should let everybody listening and watching know what the apartheid state was exactly, so we get that clear. But there was immense pressure, especially from the more radical end of the political belief spectrum, to divest any investment in South Africa, to put pressure on the government to dispense with apartheid. And I watched that and I thought, well, apartheid's a pretty brutal regime and it has its marked catastrophic disadvantages, but you bloody radicals, you're messing with things you don't understand and you're virtue signaling like mad, and you're not going to have to bear the consequences of your idiot interference. Because I figured, and I still do, that the most likely outcome for South Africa is that because of the vast disparities in population size and distribution of wealth, is that the white South Africans are going to find themselves in serious trouble. Now, that already happened in Zimbabwe, right? That already happened in Rhodesia, and we haven't talked about the relationship between those states and South Africa at all yet, but we might. But like, the most likely pathway forward is the one that requires the least intelligence and effort, right? Because there's way more ways for things to deteriorate than for them to improve. Like, there's like one way for them to improve and a million ways for them to go wrong. And the wealth disparity in South Africa is a major